Well, it's great to be back in the Molyneux Society. It's also great to be amongst the community of BSB addicts. Roy referred to the history of our association with BSB. In my case, it relates to the first time I gave a scientific paper. It was in 1967 at St Andrews, where I talked about trypanosomes in fleas, of all things. That was an epic meeting. The society has not been back to St Andrews. Not surprising, because we did serious damage to one of their treasured musical instruments. That was Roland Terry's contribution to the society. However, I think thinking about having started in parasitology 50 years ago, I want you to think in another context. 50 years from now is 2067. I'm going to show some slides shortly, which actually track back a little bit less to 2050 about the situation we might be facing then. I think the first thing to say is that since we started the NTD movement 12 years or so ago, NTDs now are embedded in the health goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is something we never considered was ever possible. The second point, though, however, is that within the context of these Sustainable Development Goals, with Matthew Bongert, hang on, Russ, which way does it go? With Matthew Bongert in WHO, Steve Lindsay, and Dirk Engels, we've looked at the 17 SDGs and looked how each one of those might interact with neglected tropical diseases, and also, because most of those diseases are parasitic, with parasitic infections. You can see, first of all, in the overarching goal of poverty alleviation, the first block is one, and we know the interaction between NTDs and poverty. The second goal is hunger, and we know the issues around food security. The third is the health goal. Then we have 4 is education, and the impact of anthelmintics on education performance is well defined. 6 is water and sanitation, and that's an obvious association, and so it goes on. Till the end one, of course, is the strength of partnerships, and I think this community, the NTD community, the drug donation community, exemplify perfectly the issues around partnership. But here, I think we have to look at what I describe as a dichotomy. The dichotomy of the goals, development goals, encompassed within the Sustainable Development Agenda, and the WHO roadmap, which is very precise about the goals for each of the individual NTDs to 2020. I want you to bear that in mind, because I do think there's a potentiality for conflict. Conflict not in the sense of physical conflict, but conflict in the context of each individual within a silo of an individual disease seeking to achieve a particular target, and the overall development agenda as articulated by the Sustainable Development Goals. But broader than that, there's another concept which has just emerged, and that is the issue of planetary health. And this is a new concept. There was a meeting last week or the week before, hosted by the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene on this very issue. And the next slides, I'm indebted to Andy Haynes for allowing me to use most of them. In fact, all of them I'm going to show are in the public domain. But Andy showed these slides, which I think are profoundly important. It's called The Great Acceleration. It's a paper in Science by Stefan. And you see socioeconomic trends here and Earth system trends on the right-hand side. Population, GDP, urban populations, and so on. In contrast, you see the changes in the Earth systems, carbon dioxide, methane, all the indicators associated with serious planetary problems. Now, planetary health is not about individual human health, it's about the health of the planet, our ecosystem. And I think it's really important then to dissect out some of the issues around that. One of the interesting factors, we talk about conflict and NTDs, the change in climate associated with the increased amount of conflict, be it interethnic, be it at a global scale. And there indeed is a suggestion of the link between climate, conflict and drought in Syria, given the pressures during the period 2000-2009 on the agricultural productivity of the poor populations in Syria, which may have had some impact on the evolution of the Syrian war. Further to that, these are projections of changes in crop yields during the period between now and 2050 and beyond. And you'll see here, this is the negative in the red, the increase in crop yields is in the green, with most of the change in crop yields being in Russia and Asia. But the deficit in crop yields in Africa, in India and so on is profound. Against that background, and I'll come to it in a minute, the issue of population growth, specifically in Africa. Now, I was at a meeting in Oxford in January of the Emerging Markets Symposium, and this is actually already published, and looking at pollution, particularly particulate matter PM2.5s, in relation to respiratory problems, respiratory disease problems in China and India associated with smogs, and the estimate that at least an extra 1 million annual deaths are associated with these increase in particulates. The other issues here, of course, is road traffic accidents, extraordinary numbers of road traffic accidents which do kill people, although they're not infectious, mental health, which I'll talk a little bit about later, conflict, and of course the almost interminable rise in diabetes. This is relevant not necessarily directly in the context of NTDs or parasitic infections, but in the context of how policymakers are going to respond to these changing global dynamics. This mental health will be by 2030 the biggest overall cause of morbidity and mortality on the planet. Now, if we then look, if we go back a decade, what has happened during the last 10 years while our NTD movement has been evolving? Global financial crash had a particular impact on all financial institutions, on donors and recipient countries. Ebola outbreak, Arab Spring, increases in problems associated with natural disasters, the emergence of ISIS and Boko Haram, increased urbanisation, the election of President Trump and Brexit. This is just in a period of 10 years. So I want you to reflect what might happen going forward. Indeed, making America great again is one thing, but making America first is another thing. That means everybody else is second, at least. Now, about 15 years ago, in a paper in the Transactions on vector-borne diseases and environment, I published this image, this figure, which looks at the drivers of health change and the impact in the centre on issues around urbanisation, habitat change, agricultural development, and changes in water resources. This has not really changed at all, but come into more focus with the science of climate change and how that has emerged. In parallel with that, the issue of a paper which we published articulating the problems of NTDs in the bottom billion in 2009. The bottom billion was a phrase used by development economists. But the bottom billion actually are the populations which suffer mostly from neglected tropical diseases. And as Peter Hotes has pointed out, the G20 countries plus Nigeria have at least 50% of the NTD problems. Those are China, in India, Indonesia, there's Nigeria, and Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Those are the countries where people have neglected tropical diseases, but they're in the poorer sectors, the very poor sectors, of some of the richest and most effectively growing economies. Now, this is a WHO text on mental health and development. We're talking about now multidisciplinarity. We're talking about the different issues around these diseases. And I've pointed out that mental health is going to be the biggest global health problem by 2030, if it isn't already. Having said that, if you look at these categories which came from the executive summary of this document, in nowhere in this document were neglected diseases or parasitic diseases mentioned. But all these characteristics in bullets are experiences and are particularly relevant to the neglected diseases. Now, we've been studying the problems of mental health in filariasis and also expanding that to look at other diseases such as trachoma, sleeping sickness, Buruli ulcer, the leishmaniasis. So what I did was actually do a word cloud of all the issues around some of the NTDs and the issues around the social and economic parameters associated with them, and clinical issues as well. And this is what emerges, and this, for me, is perhaps the best articulation of multidisciplinarity, from clinical to social to environmental. And you could pick any of the words on here, and they're relevant to the diseases we've been focusing on. One of the interesting things is that in these studies, which started with filariasis and are now going on to cutaneous leishmaniasis, is that if you use the global burden of disease metrics and methodology, certainly with filariasis, the global burden as measured in DALYs is at least twice and probably near 5 or 10 times more in terms of the mental health burden than the actual physical burden attributed to lymphedema, hydrocele, or fevers. In the case of cutaneous leishmaniasis, is 50 to 100 times more than the attributable burden of cutaneous leishmaniasis by the Global Burden of Disease Study. That is a staggering difference based on prevalence on the one hand and on the disability weights attributed on the other. In addition, mental health is a comorbidity associated with these conditions, and one of the ones that Louis Albert and Russ are highlighting with the Countdown Project are the issues around female genital schistone. Grossly underreported, ignored by the HIV community, when praziquantel, if given to young female adolescents, might have a significant impact. But also illustrative of the problem, and Russell is working on this now, on male genital schistone, which is utterly ignored as a contributor to morbidity. One of the titles in my talk is partnership, and I see various levels of partnership. The NTD drive has been based, as Roy has mentioned, very much on drug donation programs, which are to be applauded, and we would never have come as far as we perceive we have done without these donations. But there are also wider partnerships, largely disease-specific, and this is just an example of the membership of the Global Filariasis Alliance, just to illustrate the diversity of the interested parties in this particular disease, but it's representative of virtually all the partnerships, be it onchocerciasis, be it STH in children without worms, or the trachoma initiative, and so on. All these disease-specific partnerships have a huge diversity of interested parties, some of which overlap, but are indeed relevant and actually very important for sustaining the advocacy and the momentum for the control or elimination of these infections. And using the work of Mark Taylor's AWOL partnership to emphasise that within product development partnerships, the need to engage a wide group of industrial partners and alliances is critical if one is to succeed in one's objectives. So you have drug industry partnerships, the alliance partnerships, the specific partnerships associated with product development, all of which are critical. Now I want to come to the issues of control, elimination and eradication. I'm particularly involved with the guinea worm eradication program. And I want to remind you of the definition of eradication. Zero global incidence of infection caused by a specific agent. That is the critical issue. It's not a disease, it's the agent defined by the species, in this case, in the case of guinea worm, Dracunculus melunensis. But also, I want you to look at the definitions of elimination of disease and infection, and the focus of geographic here and reducing the prevalence to zero. Roy alluded in his talk to many of these issues as how you get down to sustainable absence of transmission. I'm just briefly picking back the paper which Louis Albert just mentioned, and how important it is in the context of Schisto to look at the global strategies, but also to try and implement them and see them activated at the country level. But I also think that this was my first foray into publications of schistosomiasis after 50 years, and I'm grateful for the invitation. But the point is here, and I'll come to it again in a minute, that you will not eliminate unless you get rid of the source of the infection. In Schisto, I've learned that is the Cercaria. I think you need to think about that because it's relevant to the settings of the transmission of many NTDs by vectors. Nobody's mentioned vectors this morning. If you don't stop transmission of the infective forms, you will never get down to ground zero. And if I take one example, loiasis, which is often described as the real impediment to achieving elimination in onchocerciasis and filariasis in Central Africa. Nobody has talked about how you might address the loiasis problem by reducing the burden of adult worms, adult lower worms, which generate the high microfilarias, and talking about chrysops. There was a meeting in the core NTD meeting last year in Atlanta. There were 2 hours talking about loiasis. Nobody mentioned the vector at all. Unless we think about the vectors in LF, onco, loiasis, we will fail to eliminate transmission. And I suspect that the same parallel applies to the snails. Also, whether you call these neglected diseases or not, beware of Aedes aegypti. We know dengue is on the rise, chikungunya is on the rise, Zika has emerged, yellow fever epidemics are ongoing in Brazil, in Angola, and in other parts of Africa. We have the best vaccine in the world for yellow fever. We've all had it. 10-year efficacy, 100% immunity. If we have vaccines, as Roy said, that were possible, and I'll defer to his ability to judge that, we have the best vaccine there is for an infectious agent in yellow fever, but we still have epidemics. I think also looking to the future is what has happened over the last 10 years in cell phone and smartphone technologies. We see here the use of cell phones reporting guinea worm movements. Here in the Trachoma Global Mapping Project, which is incredibly successful, rapidly mapping distribution of trachoma, and so it goes on. I've been warned to come to the end, and I'm happy to do so. But what I'd like to point out in concluding, if we look at Africa and the problems of Africa, going beyond the future, by 2030, 50% of African populations will live in cities. The projected population of Africa by 2050 will be 4 billion people. There will be a decline in crop yields between 20 and 50%. There will be high levels of water stress in North Africa in particular, and 30% increase in thermal stress if current global trends continue. So by 2015, we are now looking down into the tunnel towards 2030 and 2050. We need to see these diseases through the lens of poverty, equity, gender, human rights, universal access to healthcare. Don't expect magic bullets to emerge. We know how long it takes for them to emerge at the end of the pipeline. I could give you many examples. Let's start with bednets. 1905, Ross suggested them. They were incorporated into global fund financing in 2000. We need to make, as advocates, the best buy case, the numbers treated, the issues of these drugs being essential drugs which countries will have to pay for if they're not donated. They expect the unexpected. And the unexpected, just to give you an example, the emergence of dogs as guinea worm reservoirs, the finding of Yanomami, which we didn't know existed in the Amazon, Venezuela and Brazil, earthquakes and floods, and the disruption through conflict of African health systems. My colleagues have put together this, which will appear in the publication, and I'm grateful to Laura Dean and Sally Theobald in Liverpool for this. But I'd just like to conclude, Ross, if I may, by saying, first of all, thanks. I tried to give a wider picture of where these parasitic and tropical diseases fit in the development agenda. I tried to identify some of the challenges, the overarching drivers which we will have to face as scientists and practitioners, the links to health policy, and particularly to the competition, in inverted commas, between the emerging non-communicable diseases, be it mental health, road traffic accidents, and so on. How we fit into the development agenda, the links between NTDs and Sustainable Development Goals. And hopefully we can continue to make some progress. But in the context of elimination of the diseases which I was involved with lymphatic filariasis, it seems to me it is going to be very difficult to prove a negative. And the same with onchocerciasis. We have solved the public health problem in West Africa. Very few people are ever going to go blind again, if ever, from onchocerciasis. And people will not be disabled by lymphatic filariasis. But we may not get the last adult worm or the last microfilaria. But we will have solved the public health problem. Thanks very much, Russell.